The first time I heard this beat was 1996 in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Picture this. I'm 12 years old, wearing knee-highs, inspired by the movie Clueless. Plaid skirt, crop top, you had to be there. Actually, it's exactly what teens are wearing again today. I'm at a friend's marquesina. That's the garage. In Puerto Rico, el party de marquesina, or garage parties, are an adolescent rite of passage. Too young to go to nightclubs, but too old for birthday parties with clowns and piñatas. Teens used to hang out in backyards and garages to begin their foray into flirting, dancing, drinking, and sex. Sounds crazy saying it today, but hey, it was the 90s. So there I was with all my pent-up pre-adolescent drama when the DJ played a beat that would end up being the soundtrack to all of Puerto Rico and beyond. I can still smell the cool water cologne in the air. As the bass sent our bodies into overdrive, a voice rapping explicitly in Spanish about sex left our jaws and our butts on the floor. We'd usually form a circle, each of us waiting our turn right in the center of it. Outside that circle, the world had changed. Over the next 2 decades, this beat would crystallize into reggaeton, a musical genre mixing Jamaican dancehall, Panamanian reggae, hip-hop, and Puerto Rican underground. It would take the world by storm. Every movement has an origin story, a myth about how it all started. We tell and retell that story until it becomes legend. This is true of revolutions, countries, startups, celebrities, and musical genres. Reggaeton's origin story is all this and more. It's a story built on race, war, drugs, censorship, sex, of course, Perreo, and hell, even US imperialism and the CIA. In this podcast, we're going to tell you the real story about how reggaeton went from underground to dominating the mainstream, with all the conflict and drama along the way. But there's one part of the story that doesn't sit well with me. It kind of aggravates me. Because in this version of the story, my grandmother, Belda Gonzalez, is the conservative crusader who tried to censor reggaeton, stop it dead in its tracks, right as reggaeton was breaking onto the global stage. There are articles about her, books written about her, even songs about her, like this one. But growing up in Puerto Rico, I was told a different story about my grandma. A story about a progressive firebrand fighting for women's rights and a dedicated advocate of Puerto Rican nationhood. I wondered, was the origin story about my family's larger-than-life matriarch just that, a story? Had she in fact embarked on a crusade to kill reggaeton? Or did she throw the movement a lifeline at a pivotal tipping point? Was there another truth altogether? I had to find out. This is El Flow, a journey to the roots of reggaeton. My name is Lilia Luciano. I'm a CBS News correspondent and a Boricua born and raised in Puerto Rico, the cradle of reggaeton. You could start the story of reggaeton in Puerto Rico in the 1990s when the genre as we know it today got its start. Or you could rewind a decade earlier in Panama with reggaeton's predecessor, reggae en español. But to really understand the roots of reggaeton, we have to go back in time. Way back to July 1st, 1898. The United States and Spain are at war on the island of Cuba. It is there that another origin story gets its mythological powers, a a story that will affect much of the Caribbean and Latin America for decades to come. Among the regiments in Cuba was a ragtag volunteer unit led by the charismatic Theodore Roosevelt.
Roosevelt believed that, and I'm quoting now, that all great nations are warring nations. He was thinking of, say, ancient Rome or Napoleon's France. And he said all great men have a little of the wolf in them.
That's Clay Jenkinson, an author and presidential historian.
And Roosevelt felt that this streak of violence was not only characteristic of the American experiment, but that it was an important part of America's greatness.
Before the start of the war, Roosevelt had served as a second-in-command in the Navy. He quit that job to fulfill his romanticized war fantasy, leading the volunteer regiment known as the Rough Riders.
There were cowboys from Dakota and Wyoming and the American West, bona fide cowboys and sharpshooters, Native Americans, Indians, as he would have called them. But then he also had to bring in some of his pals from the Eastern establishment, Harvard tennis players and Yale yachtsmen and so on.
Roosevelt, the American Don Quixote, and the eclectic Rough Riders joined the battle for the city of Santiago on July 1st, 1898. The Spaniards holed up in the city, prepared to make one last stand on the surrounding hills. Their defenses dug in on the high ground of San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill as 8,000 American soldiers advanced. From above, the Spanish fired on the Americans, pinning them down.
But Roosevelt was sporting for this fight, and so, as he tells it, he came up to the base of what is San Juan or Kettle Hill, and the regular army was just kind of standing around. And so he barked out, "Who's in charge here, and why haven't you charged up this hill?" And he was told, we're waiting for orders. And so then he said, "Well, then get out of the way."
As the legend goes, the 39-year-old Roosevelt charged up the hill on horseback. The Rough Riders took heavy casualties, but were able to reach the summit. Outflanked, the Spanish retreated. 16 days later, Spain surrendered Cuba, and with it, the remains of their colonial empire. Now, you may be wondering, why are we talking about Teddy Roosevelt on a podcast about reggaeton? Well, I promise you, this will make sense. Because you can't understand reggaeton without understanding the effects of U.S. imperialism in the Caribbean. And the Spanish-American War of 1898 was the official birth of the American Empire. And TR was America's first imperialist. You see, after the war, Cuba gained its independence. The Philippines were acquired for $20 million, and Puerto Rico became a United States colony. That is important. Hold on to that. Overall, Roosevelt left Cuba dismayed and somewhat underwhelmed. But that changed when he finally came home.
What he discovers when he gets home, after what is a fairly heroic little skirmish that was unnecessary for the winning of the war, and that his achievement, however interesting it is, was relatively modest, even minor. He discovers on getting home that he's a national hero.
Roosevelt was everywhere. There were Rough Rider-themed board games for kids, cigars for adults, even Rough Rider baking powder. A year later, in 1890, President William McKinley selected Roosevelt to be his running mate for his re-election campaign. The McKinley-Roosevelt ticket won in a landslide. And here's a major plot twist. 6 months into his second term, President McKinley was shot and killed by an assassin. Just 3 years after conquering Kettle Hill, Roosevelt was now president of the United States. So how did the birth of the U.S. empire lead to reggaeton? Why does it matter? The answer lies within the music itself. Reggaeton is essentially a fusion of rhythms and cultures. This fusion didn't just magically happen on its own. People from different backgrounds had to come together in the same place at the same time. The way those different people came together was a direct result of American imperialism. And as we will see, it all started in Panama.
Roosevelt is a social Darwinist. He knew his Darwin. Well, of course, there's a dark side to social Darwinism. Roosevelt felt that the Anglo-Saxon people were at the top of the world's hierarchy as the doers. And he made wild statements about the righteousness of overwhelming indigenous peoples and bringing light into darkness and forcing them to get on board with the progress of civilization. And so he belongs to that school.
If Roosevelt played a minor yet highly publicized role in securing the independence of Cuba and the acquisition of Puerto Rico as a U.S. colony, his shadow looms large over Panama. Because Panama just happens to be an isthmus, i.e. a narrow tract of land flanked by two large bodies of water, the perfect place to build a canal. And that's exactly what Roosevelt wanted to do. On the next episode of El Flow, we look at how a racist rage and a monumental engineering feat in Panama sowed the seeds for the musical movement that gave rise to reggaeton.
We grew up in American style, American way of living. We did everything. We had Thanksgiving, we had Halloween, Father's Day, celebration. We did everything like it was the United States. That's why my upbringing was so different than in Panama.
El Flow is a production of Exile Content in partnership with iHeartRadio's My Cultura podcast network. The show is hosted by me, Lilia Luciano, a CBS News correspondent, and was created and produced by Vitenis De Julis. Production and sound design by Dixo. Additional production by David Quiñones. Original music by Truco. Production supervision by Álvaro Céspedes. Executive producers for Exile Content Studio are Nando Vila, Isaac Lee, and Alejandro Uribe. Executive producers for iHeartMedia are Connell Byrne and Giselle Bances. Special thanks to CBS News. For more podcasts from iHeart, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.